Roughly 400,000 non-German soldiers died in service of the Third Reich. Not as prisoners, not as slaves, as believers. Over 500,000 foreigners volunteered for the Waffen-SS. Not conscripted, not coerced. Volunteers. That number demands a pause. Think of it this way. That's the entire population of a mid-sized European city. Men who woke up one morning and chose to put on a German uniform, to march toward a war that was never theirs. They came from France, Norway, Denmark, Belgium, the Netherlands, Croatia, Spain. Some from countries Germany had already conquered. Some from nations technically at peace. Some from ethnic groups the Nazi ideology itself had classified as inferior. This is the part no one wants to explain. It's easier to call them all collaborators, criminals, ideological monsters. And some of them were. But the history is messier than that. Profoundly messier. By 1944, roughly one-third of Waffen-SS divisions were non-German. 1 in 3. In an army flying a German flag, built on a German ideology, commanded by a German Führer, 1 in every 3 soldiers was not German. That's not a footnote in the history books. That is the story. But before we ask why they joined, we need to ask something more uncomfortable. What did Hitler actually offer them? Not Germany. Not even the Nazi Party. Not Adolf Hitler himself. He offered them an idea. A mirror. A version of themselves they desperately needed to believe in. No one fights for a foreign flag without believing they're fighting for something larger than the flag. The year is 1940. Europe is burning. Germany has swept through Poland, France, Denmark, Norway, all within months. The old world order has collapsed. Colonial empires are fracturing. Communism is metastasizing east. Every government in Europe is either panicking, capitulating, or quietly calculating the odds. And into that vacuum, Hitler inserts a narrative. Simple, seductive, terrifying in hindsight. He says, this is not Germany's war. This is civilization's war. This is Europe's last stand against Bolshevism, against the destruction of Western culture, against the red tide rising in the East. Thousands of men across a dozen nations believed him, not because they were stupid, because they were afraid, because fear and ideology create a powerful compound, and when you add national humiliation, economic devastation, and a voice that gives your suffering a name and your enemy a face, ordinary men commit extraordinary acts. Dark acts. We study Nazi Germany with near-obsessive focus. We understand how Hitler seized power inside Germany. The beer halls, the failed coup, the Great Depression, the propaganda machine, the torchlit rallies. But we almost never ask the question that cuts deeper. How did he convince people from outside Germany, men with no natural allegiance to the Reich, to bleed for it? That question has never felt more relevant. Because the mechanics Hitler used were not uniquely German. They were not even uniquely fascist. They were human, universal, repeatable. Understanding them is not just an exercise in history. It is a warning. Buried in every recruitment poster, every radio broadcast, every ideological pamphlet, was the same line. You are not joining Germany. You are joining the future. French farmers believed it. Dutch students believed it. Scandinavian idealists looked at the ruins of the old Europe and decided, yes, this is worth dying for. Most of them did die. And the ones who survived carried that choice like a wound that never closed. So how exactly did it happen? And what does it tell us about what people are still willing to believe? Here is what the official history skips. The Waffen-SS foreign recruitment program had no unified master plan, no single document, no grand strategic blueprint drawn up in Berlin before the war began. It evolved, opportunistically, almost accidentally. Heinrich Himmler, the architect of the SS, initially wanted racial purity above everything. His early vision was a Germanic brotherhood, Nordics only. Scandinavians were acceptable. Slavs were not. The racial hierarchy was rigid, bureaucratic, obsessive. Then Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941. Suddenly, Himmler needed bodies. The Eastern Front consumed men at a rate the Reich could not sustain alone. Within months of Operation Barbarossa, German casualty figures were staggering. By December 1941, approximately 830,000 Wehrmacht casualties in 6 months. To put that in proportion, Germany was losing men faster than its training pipeline could replace them. It was like trying to fill a bathtub with the drain wide open. So the racial criteria quietly expanded, then expanded again, then became, in many cases, almost entirely negotiable. This is where the mystery deepens. If the ideology was supposed to be the foundation, the sacred core of everything the SS represented, how could that ideology bend so easily the moment it became inconvenient? Some historians, like Robert Gellately, argue the foreign recruitment reveals that Nazi ideology was always more pragmatic than it appeared. More flexible, more cynical. The racial framework was a recruiting tool as much as a genuine belief system. Useful when it drew in volunteers, quietly shelved when it didn't. Others disagree. Historian Randolph Braham maintained that ideology remained the driving force, and the foreign recruitment was a genuine attempt to cast the war as a pan-European crusade, not a contradiction of Nazi ideology, but an extension of it. Both cannot be entirely right. Neither can be entirely dismissed. What we know with certainty is this: the message changed depending on the audience. To Frenchmen, they spoke of European unity against Bolshevism. To Ukrainians, they promised liberation from Stalin. To Bosnian Muslims, they offered religious protection and ethnic legitimacy. To Scandinavians, they appealed to racial kinship and Viking mythology. Same war, same army, completely different sales pitch. That is not ideology. That is marketing. And it worked with a precision that should make us deeply uncomfortable. But the marketing needed a vehicle. A delivery mechanism capable of reaching millions of men simultaneously across a dozen languages, cultures, and border checkpoints. The answer is more systematic than you think, and far more personal than propaganda usually gets credit for. The machine had a name: the Reich Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, headed by Joseph Goebbels. Operational from March 1933. By the time the war began, it had spent 6 years perfecting its craft inside Germany. Now it exported that craft across occupied Europe. The strategy operated on 3 distinct levels simultaneously. And understanding all 3 is essential, because collapsing them into one explains nothing. The first level was media saturation. In every occupied territory, local newspapers were either shut down or absorbed. Radio stations were seized within days of German arrival. Film production was redirected. By 1942, Goebbels' ministry was producing propaganda materials in over 20 languages. 20 languages. That is not a bureaucratic footnote. That is an industrial operation. Think of it as the largest targeted communications campaign in human history, run not by algorithms, but by ideologues with printing presses and gun barrels. The messaging was never crude, never simply, "Join us or die." That approach had limits, and Goebbels understood limits better than almost anyone in the Reich. Instead, the messaging was existential. Every broadcast, every poster, every newspaper column hammered the same thesis: Bolshevism is coming. It will destroy your church, your family, your land, your culture. Germany is not invading your country. Germany is defending your country from something far worse than Germany. Fear was the architecture. Germany was the only door. The second level was economic desperation. This part is rarely discussed, but it cannot be ignored. Occupied Europe was economically devastated. Food was scarce. Employment had collapsed. In France alone, the German occupation redirected enormous portions of French industrial and agricultural output directly to the Reich, leaving ordinary French civilians in conditions of chronic shortage. In that context, military service offered something concrete: wages, food, status, and the protection that came with wearing the Reich uniform. Approximately 20,000 Frenchmen served in the Waffen-SS. That is roughly the population of a small provincial town. Men who chose a German uniform partly from ideology, and partly because ideology and hunger are not always easy to separate. The third level, and the most psychologically sophisticated, was identity. This is where Hitler's strategy diverged from ordinary wartime propaganda. He did not simply ask foreign men to serve Germany. He told them they were not serving Germany at all. He reframed the entire war as a defense of their own civilization, their own people, against a foreign, godless, destructive force. The SS recruiting poster for Flemish Belgians did not show a German eagle. It showed a medieval Flemish knight. The caption read, "Your ancestors fought for Europe. Now it is your turn. Your ancestors. Your Europe. Your turn. Not Germany's war. Yours." This is the mechanism historians like Robert Gell lately describe as the externalization of the enemy, redirecting anger, fear, and national identity away from Germany and toward a common external threat. It was not accidental. It was engineered. And here is the uncomfortable part. It was also, in some cases, not entirely dishonest. The Soviet Union under Stalin had committed genuine atrocities across Eastern Europe. The Holodomor in Ukraine, the mass deportations of Baltic populations, the NKVD executions. For men in those regions, the fear of Bolshevism was not manufactured. It was lived experience. Hitler's genius, if we can use that word carefully, was his ability to take a real fear and attach it to his own agenda. To make his war feel like your war. But who actually responded to that call? And what were they told that history still hasn't fully reckoned with? What they were told crossed a line that no recruiting poster ever printed. And the men who crafted that message never faced a single consequence for it. In the spring of 1944, a young Frenchman wrote a letter home from the Eastern Front. His name was Christian de la Maizière, 22 years old, son of a French aristocratic family, educated, idealistic. He had volunteered for the SS Charlemagne Division, France's contribution to Himmler's pan-European army. The letter did not speak of ideology. It did not speak of Bolshevism or European civilization. It spoke of mud, of cold so severe his rifle wouldn't fire, of men dying beside him whose names he had barely learned, of a war that bore no resemblance to what the posters had promised. He wrote, "We believed we were crusaders. We arrived as conscripts of something we no longer recognized." De la Maizière survived the war. Many of his comrades did not. He later documented his experience in his memoir, becoming one of the few foreign SS volunteers to publicly reckon with what he had participated in, without fully escaping his own complicity. His letter is not an anomaly. It is a pattern. Because the shock event of this story is not a single battle. It is a collective awakening, slow, brutal, irreversible, experienced by tens of thousands of foreign volunteers who arrived on the Eastern Front believing one war and found themselves fighting something else entirely. The Eastern Front was not a conventional military theater. It was an ideological killing ground. By 1942, SS units, including foreign divisions, were operating in close proximity to Einsatzgruppen mobile killing squads. These were not combat units. They were extermination units. They moved behind the front lines and murdered Jewish communities, Soviet commissars, and civilians designated as racially or politically dangerous. The foreign volunteers were not always direct participants. But proximity is its own form of knowledge. Approximately 1.5 million Jews were murdered in German-occupied Soviet territory between 1941 and 1944. That is not a statistic that stays invisible. It is a reality that leaves traces, in supply chains, in rumors, in the faces of civilians in burning villages. Men on the front lines knew more than they admitted, more than post-war testimonies often acknowledged. And yet the recruitment continued. More men volunteered. More divisions formed. More languages were added to the Reich's growing multinational army. Which raises the question that no recruitment poster ever answered. At what point does belief become complicity? There is a concept in psychology called motivated reasoning. It describes the human tendency to evaluate evidence not objectively, but in service of a conclusion already emotionally committed to. You don't follow the logic toward the truth. You follow the emotion toward a truth you need. The foreign volunteers were not uniformly fanatical. Studies of post-war testimonies, compiled by historians including Kirsten von Lingen, reveal something more disturbing than fanaticism. Most of them knew, at some level, that something was wrong. And they continued anyway. This is the psychological core of the story. Not the ideology. Not the propaganda. but the mechanism by which ordinary men sustain commitment to something they have already begun to doubt. Psychologists call it escalating commitment. Soldiers call it something simpler. You don't abandon the men beside you. By the time most foreign volunteers understood what the Eastern Front actually was, what the SS actually represented, they were already inside it. Their civilian identities had been replaced by unit identity. Their personal moral frameworks had been overwritten by military hierarchy. Leaving was not simply ideologically difficult. It was structurally nearly impossible. Desertion from the Waffen-SS carried the death penalty. That single fact reframes everything. The line between volunteer and prisoner is not always a line. Sometimes it is a slow gradient, and you don't notice you've crossed it until the crossing is complete. Stop for a moment. You are 23 years old. You crossed a border 6 months ago. You believed the speech. You wore the uniform publicly. Your name was printed in a newspaper back home. Now you understand what this army is actually doing behind the front lines. Desertion means death. The men beside you are the only people who still know your name. What do you do? That is not a rhetorical question. It is the exact calculation tens of thousands of real men faced. Most of them chose to stay. Before you judge them, be honest about why. But the psychological damage ran deeper than fear of punishment. Many foreign volunteers had publicly declared their allegiance. They had appeared in recruitment films. Their names had been printed in collaborationist newspapers. Their families knew. Their communities knew. To abandon the cause was to retroactively become a traitor, not to Germany, but to their own stated beliefs, their own public identity. The propaganda machine had been sophisticated enough to make the volunteers its own enforcers of their commitment. That is not coincidental. That is architecture. Harold Welser, a German social psychologist, argued in his landmark study that ordinary men commit atrocities not because ideology fully possesses them, but because the social structure around them makes violence the path of least resistance. The uniform does not change the man. It changes what the man believes he is permitted to do. And what happens when that permission structure collapses, when the war itself begins to collapse, is where this story turns darkest of all. Because when the structure finally fell, it didn't liberate these men. It left them trapped between a cause that had consumed them and a world that would never forgive them for it. By 1943, the Waffen-SS foreign recruitment program had become something its architects never originally envisioned. It had become a system, not a collection of individual decisions made by desperate men in occupied territories. A structured, bureaucratized, multilingual machine with dedicated recruiting offices, translation departments, ideological training curricula, and liaison officers assigned to specific ethnic communities across a dozen countries. Himmler had wanted a Germanic brotherhood. What he built was something far stranger. He built a multinational army held together not by shared nationality, not by shared language, but by shared enemy. The divisions tell the story better than any policy document. The SS Charlemagne Division, French. The SS Viking Division, Scandinavian and Germanic volunteers. The SS Handschar Division, Bosnian Muslims. The SS Galicia Division, Ukrainian. The SS Netherlands Division, Dutch. The SS Wallonian Division, French-speaking Belgians. Each division was a microcosm of the same central contradiction. Men recruited on the promise of protecting their own culture, absorbed into a machine that served someone else's. The Handschar Division deserves particular examination, because it breaks almost every assumption about what the SS was and who it recruited. Formed in 1943, the 13th Waffen Mountain Division of the SS was composed primarily of Bosnian Muslim volunteers. They were permitted to practice Islam. They were provided imams. Their divisional insignia incorporated a traditional fez alongside the SS Death's Head. Himmler, the man who had constructed an entire racial theology, allowed a Muslim religious structure to operate inside his ideologically pure army. The reason was coldly pragmatic. Bosnia was strategically critical. Partisan resistance was intense. Local knowledge was invaluable. And the Bosnian Muslim population had genuine, historically rooted fears of Serbian nationalist violence. Fears that predated Nazi Germany entirely. Once again, a real fear, attached to someone else's agenda. The Handschar Division ultimately numbered approximately 21,000 men. That is equivalent to filling a large sports stadium, with soldiers recruited from a community that Nazi racial theory officially classified as non-Aryan. The ideology bent. The recruitment continued. But the expansion of the foreign program created a problem the Reich never adequately solved. Loyalty. German officers commanding foreign divisions filed consistent reports throughout 1943 and 1944 describing the same fundamental tension. Foreign soldiers fought effectively when defending territory they personally identified with. They fought poorly, sometimes catastrophically, when deployed far from home for purely German strategic objectives. The Handschar Division mutinied in September 1943, before it even reached the front. Several hundred soldiers killed German and ethnic German officers and attempted to defect. The mutiny was suppressed. The soldiers involved were executed. The SS Galicia Division, composed of Ukrainian volunteers who had joined specifically to fight Soviet forces, showed high combat effectiveness on the Eastern Front. But proposals to redeploy them westward produced immediate resistance. They were not fighting for Germany. They had never been fighting for Germany. They were fighting for Ukraine, using German weapons, German supply lines, German command structures. The moment German strategic interests diverged from their personal national interests, the alliance fractured. This is the central structural weakness the propaganda machine could never overcome. You can recruit men with one war. You cannot always keep them for a different one. And yet the numbers kept growing. By 1944, non-German personnel within Waffen-SS ranks had reached levels that prompted internal Reich debates about the future of the organization itself. Some senior SS figures argued the foreign recruitment had fundamentally compromised the ideological integrity of the entire institution. They were correct, and they were ignored, because the Eastern Front required bodies, and bodies required recruitment, and recruitment required promises, and the promises had long since outrun anything the Reich could actually deliver. There is a particular document from this period that historians return to repeatedly. A 1943 internal SS memorandum, partially declassified from Bundesarchiv holdings, noting that foreign recruits in several divisions were showing insufficient ideological commitment and required supplementary political education. Supplementary political education. The language is bureaucratic. The reality it describes is not. Men who had volunteered, who had crossed borders and abandoned civilian lives, were now being identified as insufficiently committed to the ideology they had supposedly joined to defend. The machine was cannibalizing its own premise. And somewhere in the background of all this expansion, all this recruitment, all these divisions with their flags and their fez caps and their multilingual prayer books, the Holocaust was accelerating. The death camps were operating at full capacity. The Einsatzgruppen were completing their work in the East. The machinery of industrial murder was running parallel to the machinery of military recruitment. These were not separate programs. They were the same program, wearing different uniforms. Which raises the question that foreign volunteers' post-war testimonies almost universally refused to answer directly. How much did they know? And how much of what they knew did they choose, very deliberately, not to see? By late 1944, the architecture was visibly failing. Not just militarily, psychologically, structurally, at every level simultaneously. The Eastern Front had reversed. Soviet forces were pushing west with a momentum that no amount of ideological commitment could stop. The propaganda machine that had promised European civilization salvation was now asking its foreign soldiers to die defending German soil, territory that had never been theirs, for a cause that was clearly lost. The recruitment pitch had been, join us to protect your homeland. The reality had become, die here, far from it. In January 1945, the SS Charlemagne Division, the French volunteers, was deployed to defend Berlin itself. Of the approximately 7,000 Frenchmen who had served in Charlemagne throughout the war, fewer than 400 remained combat effective by February 1945. 400. From 7,000. Imagine a village. Imagine watching it empty, man by man, over 4 years. That is the human scale of that number. Those who remained fought in the ruins of Berlin during the final Soviet assault in April 1945. Some historians note they fought with particular ferocity, not from loyalty to Hitler, but because surrender meant Soviet captivity, and for foreign SS volunteers, Soviet captivity carried its own specific terror. They had no good options left. Every exit had been closed by their own earlier choices. The collapse of the foreign SS program did not produce mass defection. It produced paralysis. Men who had publicly committed, ideologically invested, and socially isolated themselves from any alternative identity discovered they had nowhere to retreat to. Some surrendered to Western Allied forces, calculating, correctly, in some cases, that American or British captivity was survivable in ways Soviet captivity was not. Some disappeared into civilian populations across Europe, shedding uniforms and fabricating histories. Some were captured, tried, and executed. France alone tried thousands of wartime collaborators in the immediate post-war period. The SS volunteers who returned faced courts, prisons, and a social death that often outlasted any legal sentence. Christian de la Maizière, the young aristocrat whose letter opened this story, returned to France and lived with the weight of his choices publicly, uncomfortably, for decades. He never fully explained himself, perhaps because the explanation required admitting something that implicates more than just one man, more than just one war, more than just one moment in history. Here is the thing no documentary tells you. The foreign volunteers were not an aberration. They were a proof of concept. What Hitler demonstrated, inadvertently, through the sheer scale of the foreign SS program, was that ideology is portable. That fear travels across borders more efficiently than armies. That a man will fight and die for something that was never originally his, provided the narrative is constructed carefully enough. This is not a 1940s problem. The same architecture, real grievance, external enemy, reframed identity, escalating commitment, has appeared in every major radicalization pipeline studied since. Rwanda, Bosnia, the foreign fighter networks that drew thousands of Western-born men to conflict zones decades after Nuremberg. Researchers studying foreign fighter recruitment in modern conflicts have noted structural parallels to the SS foreign program so precise they are uncomfortable to read. Same mechanism, different flags. The Waffen-SS foreign recruitment program ultimately drew volunteers from over 30 nations. 30 nations. More countries than participated in the 1936 Berlin Olympics. That is not a military statistic. That is a map of human vulnerability. And here is the final twist, the part that reframes everything that came before it. The men who designed the foreign recruitment program did not primarily believe in their own ideology. Himmler was pragmatic above all. Goebbels was a communicator who understood messaging as a technical craft. The senior SS officers who oversaw foreign divisions were, in many documented cases, privately contemptuous of the very racial theories they publicly enforced. They did not need to believe it. They needed other people to believe it. Consider Leon Degrelle. He commanded the SS Wallonian Division, French-speaking Belgian volunteers. He personally led them across thousands of miles of Soviet territory. He was decorated directly by Hitler with the Knight's Cross. He gave speeches. He appeared in films. He was the face of foreign SS heroism. His men died in their thousands. In Russia, in Romania, in the ruins of Berlin. Degrelle fled Europe in a stolen German aircraft in May 1945, crash landing on a Spanish beach. Francisco Franco's government sheltered him. Belgium formally demanded his extradition 4 separate times. Spain refused every time. He lived in Malaga, gave interviews into the 1980s, expressed no remorse, faced no trial, no prison, no accounting. He died in 1994, at 87 years old, in his bed, with a view of the Mediterranean. The men he recruited died in frozen Soviet mud 50 years before him. Their families received nothing. Their names appear in no monument. He lived well. They did not. That is what the machine was ultimately built to protect. Not the cause. Not the volunteers. The men at the top. The ones who never believed a word of it. That is the coldest lesson this history offers. The architects of mass ideological movements are rarely its most sincere members. Sincerity belongs to the recruits. Calculation belongs to the recruiters. The French farmer who died in a Berlin ruin in April 1945 believed something. The men who sent him there believed in something else entirely. Christian de la Maizière, near the end of his life, was asked directly, "Why did you go?" He paused for a long time. Then he said, "We were given an enemy before we were given a reason." And that was enough. It was enough in 1941. The question worth sitting with, the one that demands an honest answer, is whether the distance between then and now is as large as we need it to be.